Can you explain more about what led to this and how are businesses feeling the impact?
Well, I think a lot of that comes from going back to the point that the Democrats here had not had full party control. We've had, right? Minnesota's a fairly divided state. We'd be considered a purple state. Not necessarily in presidential elections in the recent history of our country, but Minnesota has had divided government between our House and our Senate, or the governorship here, pretty consistently for the last 20 to 30 years. So when the Democrats were able to take complete control here last year, they had about a 10-year wish list and on top of that, they had that $18 billion surplus, which was carryover from previous budget cycles, some COVID money in there. But so it was kind of a perfect storm.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the American Potential Podcast. I'm Heather Andrews, your guest host for today's show, and the Western Regional State Director for Americans for Prosperity. Have you experienced this before? You head to the grocery store and pick up your favorite ice cream, coffee, or chips, only to find out that the price has gone up, or the package is smaller but costs the same. It's frustrating to realize you're getting less for your money. But have you ever wondered why the company made the change? Some might be quick to say it's the company wanting to make more profits. But is that really the case? When Congress or state governments pass new laws and regulations, it often adds to the cost of doing business. Companies then face a tough choice. They either have to raise prices or reduce the product size and see how customers respond and readjust if they must. In Minnesota, they've been passing bills that include tax increases for businesses, forcing them to face this difficult decision. Even though the state has passed these bills, one was stopped that would have affected fuel standards and would have not only affected grocery store prices, but almost every aspect of life. There was a diverse coalition that came together to stop this bill, and one of those involved was the Minnesota Grocer Association. I want to welcome Steve Barthel, who is the Government and Community Relations Manager for the Minnesota Grocer Association. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, Heather. Good to be with you.
So your organization plays a unique role in Minnesota's grocery landscape. Can you share a little bit about what the work you do, or about the work you do, and what drives your team's mission here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Minnesota Grocers Association is the only trade association in the state. We're about 120, for the food industry, we say from farm to fork, we're about 125 years old, which makes us one of the oldest trade organizations, not only in the state, but in the country. And we represent everyone from food producers, manufacturers, transportation companies, wholesalers, all the way down to the retail level. So we have a really good understanding of the entire ecosystem of the how food gets from the ground to the consumers. So our job here is to speak on behalf of our members and to represent them at the Capitol here in St. Paul and around the state, to make sure that they understand the impacts of the policies and the proposals that they put forth, and what the real world impacts of those are for our members, businesses in the state, and ultimately consumers.
Yeah, awesome. And a lot of times when we think about grocery costs, I think the average person like myself, we don't always consider how other industries necessarily play a role in that. So how are grocers in Minnesota impacted by changes outside the food industry?
Yeah, that's a great point, and something that we've been talking to legislators and candidates about here as we're moving up to this next election cycle. That the policies that happen in St. Paul don't happen in a vacuum, right? When you propose legislation or you pass bills that have an impact on labor costs, the cost of energy, specifically for our industry, because there are so many touches between when something goes into the ground to when it is eventually shipped and boxed and sold at a store, you're going to have multiple transportation companies, multiple packagers, wholesalers, vendors. So there's kind of a cascading effect that happens. So when we were talking about the clean transportation standards that you mentioned before, there's cost added at the farm level, and then every transportation step along the way, right? It probably is hauled 6 or 7 different times. So it's not just one time that you raise the cost. It's a cascading effect all the way through the food chain. Ultimately, consumers don't see it until it gets to checkout. But that's not unique to just transportation. It also impacts labor policies, energy policies, anything that increases the cost of goods. Doesn't do it just once. It does it multiple times as it comes through your food chain system.
Right. And so, so the state, obviously, Minnesota's been busy passing bills, many of which kind of add, like you kind of talked about, to the cost burden for these grocers and a lot of other businesses as well. But could you shed light on some of the most recent policies that are impacting your members the most?
Yeah, absolutely. Legislators were really busy here in Minnesota in 2023 and 2024. For the first time in about a decade, we had full Democrat control here. Very thin margins in the House and Senate, but they moved forward with a pretty aggressive agenda. A lot of those focused on labor issues. We saw the passage of an earn sick and safe time mandate, delivery fees now on products around the state, increased sales taxes, specifically here in the metro up to a 1 full point, a clean energy by 2040 mandate, which is really we're seeing impacting the cost of energy for our members already, as much as 20 or 30% over last year. And as from the retail standpoint, big square footage, a lot of energy goes into these stores to keep the lights on and to keep coolers running. And that's about the 3rd highest expense for our members. So cost of energy is a big one. But I would say the largest come down to those labor policies. And the paid family medical leave program that will not start until January 1st of 2026. With a direct payroll tax on every employer and every employee in the state, that has not even kicked in yet. And that's going to be about almost a full point between the split between the employer and the employee is coming towards us. But we're seeing a dramatic cost in pretty much every category for our members. All of the inputs are continuing to increase, which is why in a market, right, there was a recent survey done where the average profit margin for a retail grocer, an independent grocer, is about 1.6%. So when you're adding costs on one end of the equation, it's going to come out on the other end eventually, which is part of the reason why you're seeing some of this shrinkflation that you're talking about, or increase in costs. But the labor ones have been a really tough one for our members.
Yeah. And like you said, these new mandates are kind of a big shift for Minnesota. So from your perspective, like, how do you see these changes affecting everyday Minnesotans in the long run? Because as you said, it trickles down. But yeah, like
Well, on top of the direct payroll tax that we're going to be seeing from the paid family medical leave bill, and that will be taking effect here on January 1 of 2026. All of these inputs, as they continue to go up, and it's not just in our industry, it's for businesses across the state. It makes it harder for folks to be employed, for businesses to stay afloat. So there's definitely a concern that the job market here in Minnesota has already shown it's stagnated in a lot of its economic categories for job growth and growth of our GDP, and you're seeing an outward movement of wealth, just general wealth, leaving the state as folks are starting to leave the state as the increasing cost of living and cost of goods. But I think folks are going to continue to feel that impact as costs for businesses across the state continue to increase. So are the costs of everyday goods, whether it's your grocery store, your hardware store, just services around that you need around your house. I think Minnesotans are really feeling it. And I don't know if that trend is going to slow, especially as some of these new laws and mandates come online here within the next year or so.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad that you brought up in your last question, you talked about, profit margins being so low for grocery stores, because I think a lot of people don't understand, like, these are not major, like, hugely profitable corporations that are just looking to, take advantage of shoppers and the consumers and everyday Americans. They are barely making a profit.
Yeah.
And just trying to provide a lot of times often the best service they can to their communities.
Yeah,
So
100%.
what's confusing to me is the state of Minnesota had an $18 billion surplus, yet it seems to have basically disappeared almost overnight due to recent legislation. So can you explain more about what led to this and how are businesses feeling the impact?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of that comes from going back to the point that the Democrats here had not had full party control. We've had, Minnesota's a fairly divided state. We'd be considered a purple state, not necessarily in presidential elections in the recent history of our country, but Minnesota has had divided government between our House and our Senate, or the governorship here, pretty consistently for the last 20 to 30 years. So when the Democrats were able to take complete control here last year, they had about a 10-year wish list and on top of that, they had that $18 billion surplus, which was carryover from previous budget cycles, some COVID money in there. But so they had it was kind of a perfect storm for businesses here where they got control, had all this money, had the wish list, and they had the funds to make some of those things, or nearly all of those things that were on their top of their priority list happen. And we're seeing the impacts of that and those policies. And I think I'd like to take a step back and look and think that I think a lot of those policies are well intentioned, right? They think folks should have time off.
Always are, right? Always are the best intentions, but
there's a disingenuous nature right, to passing these policies that are going to cost businesses money, are going to increase operating costs, wages, the cost of energy, the cost of transportation. So you're causing all of these increases, but then to turn around and claim that there's price gouging going on in an industry with such a low profit margin. I can tell you that especially the rhetoric we've heard at the national level about price gouging and to your point about folks are just trying to get by and keep their doors open, that it angers the folks that I go out there and talk to, who are just trying to do the best they can for their communities, to be involved, to turn some of that net profit margin into donations to your schools and your clubs in town, especially in your small cities around the state, which it's becoming harder and harder to operate in, especially under this business environment. And we really talk to legislators and let them know, try to make them understand who really loves these top-down policies are your big corporations, right? If you're a Walmart or a Target and you have hundreds or thousands of stores across the country that you can spread out this cost in the state of Minnesota, you can spread it around to your other stores. If you're a mom and pop shop, you have one or two stores, you can only spread it so far. And you're either going to have to cut back on staff, on the hours that you're open, or eventually, if there's no profit there, you're going to have to look at closing your doors. So I think that's something that we're really working in. Unfortunately, they did not want to hear that message from the business community writ large last session. So we're really out there pushing that message and hoping that they will come around and understand some of the realities of the policies and decisions that they've made.
Right. And it seems like it's a good thing for companies too, to you brought up a good point with, government passing these, things down on the corporations, businesses, policy wise, but it's we're talking about long-term pay or just even leave, how they decided to leave. I think if they leave it to the companies and businesses, it actually creates this competition, right? So it's they can, entice employees to come work for them and say, hey, look what we give you for, paternity leave or maternity leave versus this other one. And so I just think it's insane to me that they don't understand, like, companies are actually almost more so incentivized to compete against each other regarding some of those benefits because it looks better. Like it does. Like as a person who looks for a job, like I'm going to be looking for that as well. Like not only how much they're going to pay me salary wise, but what do the benefits look like? And it's a great way for them to compete against each other for the best candidates to come work for them. So yeah, it's extremely frustrating that government gets in the way as often as they do and create problems for everyone, including trickling all the way down to the people that go and visit these stores. So we kind of talked a little bit about, you kind of mentioned the Clean Transportation Standard Act, and it stirred up quite a bit of discussion this last session. So can you give us an overview of what it aimed to achieve and then why it was so controversial?
Sure. I'll do my best. I'm by no means an expert in the impacts or right. Our standpoint was coming to it and saying, if you do this, right, if you're looking to create certain fuel standards that are going to make Minnesota match or come close to those that have been passed, let's say in California, where you see extremely high gas prices. One thing and another thing we've talked about is that this last legislative session, there seemed to be a continued attempt to make Minnesota a regulatory island here in the Midwest. So if you want to set all of these new standards for liquid fuels in the state of Minnesota, that we don't have the power that a California does, right? California is a large enough market that it can drive change. People are going to adjust to the rules in California because they want to be able to operate in that market. If Minnesota and California have the same rules for their clean fuel standards, we're not only going to have prices similar to that of California, but they're going to be higher, right? Because that product is going to have to be shipped to Minnesota, and you're going to have companies that are right that it's going to have to be profitable for them to put in that work to get it all the way here, and then to sell it in our stores. But then also we're surrounded by 4 other states that aren't going to have these rules, that if you live anywhere in a border community, that why would you purchase gas in the state of Minnesota when you can drive across to North Dakota or Wisconsin or Iowa to fill up the same, right? Fill up your vehicle for an extremely lower rate. So our standpoint when we came to it was that this is just making us an island that's going to increase costs for consumers, but then also for getting products to our stores. Right, if trucks are having to fill up with $5 a gallon diesel, it's going to increase the cost dramatically of what a truckload costs to get it delivered, and from the farm to the production company to the wholesaler and eventually to your retailer. So just the increased cost of energy across the board impacts everyone, but I think our industry specifically.
Yes, agreed. So tell us about the coalition that came together. It sounds like it was a pretty broad coalition, maybe unlikely allies that came together to, talk to legislators about this bill and share the potential impact it was going to have. Can you tell us about that coalition a little bit and who you worked with to kind of defeat this? And
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it really spanned the spectrum, right? Anyone who would be impacted by this, right? Whether you're a consumer organization, a trade organization, obviously the petroleum folks were very interested in this, but then also our retailers, right? If you're a gas retailer and you're particularly if you're operating in a border community, right, there's not going to be a gas station open within 40 miles of the border, right? If we're surrounded on every side. So it was a good and active group who right wanted to really highlight some of these issues that were coming forth. Right, anyone who has any facing with consumers has to sell a product, has to produce a product. We're all on board. So it was a large group. and we were able to have some success. I would say it was one of the few spots this year where we were able to take what we thought was a obviously bad idea and a policy that should not be pursued and didn't matter or didn't make sense for the state of Minnesota. That we were able to push back to the point where it's like, all right, let's slow down here a little bit and let's think about what the actual impacts of this would be and why it doesn't make sense here. So it was a good and active group that was able to really have that impact.
Well, that's good. So what messages did resonate? Like there might be some other states that are going to be facing this similar issue. I can't imagine that Minnesota is just going to be the only state that is going to, see this legislation come forward. So what were some of the strongest messages that resonated with legislators regarding this, that they were like, okay, all right, maybe we should take a step back and take a look at this a little bit more before we just move forward with this policy.
Right. And they certainly didn't back away from it because they didn't believe wholeheartedly, right, that they were trying to
save the environment.
Good things for the environment. I think there was more a political reality that if folks see that you're going to raise the cost of their gasoline by a huge amount, right, and you can champion electric vehicles, and new alternative methods of transportation, and I think people, generally speaking, are in favor of that. But it comes down to what's practical. Here in the state of Minnesota, right, a huge percentage of our folks still commute in their personal vehicle.
I think that's across the country too. I mean, I don't think it's just, no matter what legislators want, or, some legislators, especially those on the left, perceive, I think that is the majority of Americans across the United States. Most of us do commute to work.
And I think Minnesota commuters are still pretty high on the list as to their average daily number of miles.
Absolutely. Yeah, right. It's a big state.
Especially if you're in the outstate parts of Minnesota, right? You don't have an electric vehicle charging station nearby, right? I think it's one of those things that people are seeing as a, something extra, something that's nice to have, not something that works all year, depending on the weather here or depending on the part of the state that you're in with the number of charging stations. So I think it ultimately came down to the understanding that, right, we also had a debate about the gas tax here in the state of Minnesota. So they did it, and even that was a controversial thing that they've now tied it to a rate of inflation. So every year you're going to see a small increase in the gas tax, and even getting that through, I think, was right. And you're talking about cents, right, as opposed to the CTS, which would make things dollars more expensive. Right. Alan. So I think there was an understanding of the political realities and right, the real world realities as to what this would mean to consumers, to low income folks, right, and like we were talking about with the mandates on businesses, the folks who are really impacted by these changes are folks that don't have the ability to absorb increased costs. So I think that was ultimately what the messaging that I think made them have to slow down on this.
Right. As if inflation hasn't already raised the costs for every American in this country to where they're paying most often over $1,000 a month more, just to make ends meet, more than they were 4 years ago. So agreed. As
a father of three young girls, I can tell you that we feel it too, right? You're folks who run businesses who have to, right? Like everybody else. That's the unique thing about our industry. It's everyone's got to eat, right? Everybody's coming to the grocery store. We see it. We see the struggles that folks are having. But we're in a unique position where we can kind of try to express why some of these things are happening and explain to people and to legislators, like there's a direct correlation here between the decisions you make and the impact on consumers.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to kind of my last question too. So For those that are following, similar issues in their states, like kind of we talked about, what advice would you give them, especially business owners who are trying to prepare for potential cost increases or policies like this? Is there anything and any advice you'd give them right now?
Well, if you're in a state where these things have not happened, I guess I would some of these labor policies and energy policies, get involved. I guess you got it right. If you can stop them before they happen, you're going to be in a lot better place, because I know there are a lot of these policies that have been discussed around here for 10 years as we've been going through divided government. Get involved, make your voices heard before things become statute. And I think that's something that we're facing here, because you can't, even we had very slim margins here, a one seat majority in the Senate and a 4-seat majority in the House. So we thought we were going to have a chance. Like, there's going to be some reasonable legislators. They're going to talk to us. We're going to be able to explain to them why these are bad ideas. And you can't count on that in today's political environment. I think you have to try to get ahead of things and make the points. And I think you can identify states like Minnesota that have had policies like this enacted and point to some of the challenges that we are having and we are seeing. And we're happy to be a resource for folks if they're having questions. I'm happy to try to help, because it's once that ball is rolling, it's very hard to stop.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Steve, and appreciate your time today. And thank you for all you've done for the state of Minnesota, and especially for the grocers in the area and for the consumers as well. And I'm so happy to hear that at least that bad policy wasn't able to move through. And yeah, and I love that. And it takes me right into kind of our call to action, which is liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Get out there and defend freedom and liberty. And if you would like to get connected with an Americans for Prosperity state chapter, be sure to email Jeff at AmericanPotential.com. And our podcast is always working on stories to help keep you inspired and informed. And the best way to stay connected is by liking and subscribing to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you know of a great story of someone that is working to expand freedom and opportunities that we should share, be sure to go to our website, AmericanPotential.com, and fill out our Share Your Story section. Thanks for being with us, and remember, your voice and your actions matter and make a difference.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.